Arthur Grayson, a grieving widower estranged from his only son, stumbles upon an eerie porcelain doll at a dusty antique shop. The shopkeeper whispers it belonged to a boy who tragically died and hints it might help lonely hearts. Desperate to bridge the emotional chasm with his son, Arthur buys the doll and places it in his son's childhood room. At first, it seems innocent, but then the doll begins shifting positions, whispering at night and uncovering secrets Arthur wishes he hadn't learned. Arthur Grayson trudged through the damp streets of his sleepy town, his coat soaked by persistent drizzle. Life had become an endless loop of gray days since his wife passed away 5 years ago. His only son, Ethan, had been estranged for years, and Arthur's old Victorian house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt more like a tomb. On one of his aimless evening walks, Arthur noticed something peculiar. A shop he swore had never been there before. Its faded sign, barely legible in the misty glow of a street lamp, read Memory Lane Antiques. Against his better judgment, or perhaps drawn by curiosity, Arthur stepped inside. The bell above jingled softly as Arthur entered. The air was heavy with the scent of aged wood and mothballs, and dust floated lazily in the dim light streaming through grimy windows. Shelves groaned under the weight of strange objects. Tarnished clocks, cracked porcelain, and faded photographs of people long forgotten. Arthur's footsteps echoed faintly as he wandered deeper into the maze of relics, feeling strangely as though he were walking through a dream. "Looking for something?" a voice rasped behind him. Arthur turned sharply, startled by the sudden intrusion. The speaker was a wiry man with sunken eyes and a face etched with time. His bony fingers rested on a glass counter filled with trinkets, watches, and peculiar jewelry. Arthur hesitated. "Just browsing," he mumbled, unsure of why he'd even entered the shop. The man tilted his head, studying Arthur with a look that was both curious and unsettling. "People don't come here unless they're looking for something," he said cryptically. His words sent a faint shiver through Arthur, but he chose to ignore them. Arthur let his gaze wander, trying to escape the man's piercing eyes, until something in the far corner of the shop caught his attention. It was a porcelain doll, seated upright in an ornate wooden chair. Its glass eyes glinted faintly in the dim light, and its painted lips curved in a delicate, almost knowing smile. Dressed in a faded blue sailor suit, the doll seemed unnervingly lifelike. "What's the story behind that one?" Arthur asked, pointing at the doll. The shopkeeper's expression shifted, a shadow passing over his gaunt features. "That doll," he began slowly, "belonged to a lonely boy, much like yourself, I'd imagine." He paused, his voice lowering. "They say it brought him comfort. After the boy passed, it found its way here. Some believe it connects hearts, but—" He trailed off, his words hanging ominously in the air. "Not always in the way one expects." Arthur frowned. The story was unsettling, yet something about the doll held his attention. Was it the craftsmanship? The eerie lifelikeness of its features? Or was it something deeper, something he couldn't quite explain? "How much?" Arthur asked abruptly, cutting through the tension. The shopkeeper hesitated as though weighing something in his mind before naming a price. It was higher than Arthur had anticipated, but he paid without hesitation. The man carefully wrapped the doll in brown paper, his hands lingering on it for a moment before handing it over. "Be careful with it," he said quietly. "Sometimes it has a mind of its own." Arthur dismissed the comment as an attempt to add mystique, but the words lingered in his mind as he stepped back into the rain, the package tucked under his arm. When Arthur returned home, the house seemed colder than usual, the kind of chill that seeped into the bones. He unwrapped the doll and carried it upstairs to Ethan's old bedroom. The room had remained untouched since the argument that drove Ethan away, a shrine to a childhood that now felt impossibly distant. Arthur placed the doll on the dresser beneath a faded photograph of Ethan as a boy. For a moment, Arthur allowed himself a flicker of hope. Perhaps the doll could be a symbol of reconciliation, a way to bridge the chasm that had grown between him and his son. That night, Arthur dreamt of Ethan as a child. In the dream, they were playing catch in the backyard, the air filled with the sound of Ethan's laughter. But the dream darkened. Ethan's laughter turned to sobs, and when Arthur turned, he saw his son clutching the doll, tears streaming down his face. "Help me, Dad," Ethan cried. Arthur woke with a start, his heart pounding, the dream lingering like a shadow. The next morning, as Arthur passed Ethan's room, he froze. The doll was no longer on the dresser where he had left it. It was sitting on the bed, its head tilted slightly toward the door. Arthur's stomach churned, but he shook off the unease. He must have moved it the night before and forgotten. After all, his memory wasn't as sharp as it used to be. But as the days passed, the doll's presence became harder to ignore. Arthur began to notice it in different positions, its glassy eyes seemingly following him whenever he entered the room. At night, he started hearing faint whispers like the rustling of leaves. At first, he dismissed them as tricks of his imagination, but one night, the whispers formed words. A child's voice, soft but distinct. "Help me, Dad." Arthur froze, his blood turning to ice. The voice wasn't his imagination. It was real, and it was coming from the doll. Arthur stared at the doll for what felt like an eternity, the faint echo of the words, "Help me, Dad," ringing in his ears. His breath quickened and he instinctively backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind him. For a moment he stood in the hallway, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. This wasn't real, he told himself. It couldn't be. He was overtired, maybe hallucinating. That had to be it. But the voice, it wasn't something he could ignore. The clarity of it, the way it pierced the air, it was too vivid to be imagination. He poured a glass of whiskey, the liquid trembling in his unsteady hands. Sitting in his darkened living room, he tried to rationalize the events of the past few days. The shopkeeper's warning, the doll's movements, the whispers. They couldn't all be coincidence. Could they? He glanced at the staircase, half expecting to see the doll peering down at him. Shaking his head, he downed the whiskey and resolved to confront the doll. He wasn't superstitious, and he wasn't about to let an old toy drive him mad. Gathering his courage, Arthur crept back upstairs and opened the door to Ethan's room. The doll sat on the bed, its head tilted slightly. Arthur stepped closer, his pulse thundering in his ears. He picked it up, its porcelain face cold and smooth against his fingertips. "You're just a toy," he whispered as if convincing himself. "Nothing more." But even as he spoke, the room seemed darker, the shadows heavier. He placed the doll back on the dresser and left, shutting the door firmly behind him. That night, the dreams returned. Arthur saw Ethan as a child again, running through the house, laughing, but the laughter turned to sobs. Arthur found Ethan crouched in the corner of his old room, clutching the doll. "Help me, Dad," Ethan sobbed. "Why didn't you help me?" Arthur jolted awake, sweat soaking his sheets. The words from the dream echoed in his mind. He couldn't let this go on. The next morning, Arthur returned to the antique shop, determined to demand answers from the shopkeeper. But when he reached the alley, he froze. The storefront was gone. In its place was an abandoned building, its windows boarded up. Arthur stared, his mind racing. Had the shop ever been real? No, he muttered. He had the doll, proof that the shop existed, but the realization did little to ease his dread. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Arthur sat across from the doll, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "What do you want from me?" he muttered. The doll, of course, said nothing, but the room felt heavier, the air pressing down like a weight. Desperate, Arthur searched the doll for clues. As he ran his fingers along its back, he felt a bulge beneath the fabric of its sailor suit. His heart racing, he unbuttoned the tiny outfit. Sewn into the doll's back was a small, leather-bound notebook. Arthur's hands trembled as he pulled it free. The pages were filled with messy, childlike handwriting. Lonely. Miss Dad. Why doesn't he talk to me anymore? Arthur's throat tightened as he read further, the words growing more desperate. He doesn't love me. I want to come home. Please, Dad. Arthur's vision blurred with tears. The words felt like a dagger. But something didn't add up. Ethan had never written these words, or at least not that Arthur knew. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the tone too pained. Had another child owned the doll before it ended up in the shop? In the final pages, Arthur found a crude drawing of a man and a boy holding hands, the boy clutching the doll. Beneath it were the words, "Don't leave me." Arthur's hands shook as he closed the notebook. The room felt colder, the shadows pressing in around him. He returned the notebook to the doll and placed it on the table. For the first time, he felt truly afraid. Not just of the doll, but of what it represented. The guilt he had carried for years, the pain of losing Ethan, it was all bubbling to the surface. That night, Arthur couldn't sleep. He sat in the living room, the doll on the coffee table. The house was silent, save for the grandfather clock ticking. Arthur stared at the doll, his mind racing. Who had owned it before? What did the shopkeeper know? And, most importantly, what did the doll want? As the hours passed, Arthur's exhaustion began to weigh on him. He wanted to burn the doll, to rid himself of it, but something stopped him. A feeling, an almost parental instinct, kept him from destroying it. Instead, he continued to stare at its lifeless form, willing it to remain still. At midnight, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't faint. They were clear. "Help me," the voice said, louder, insistent. Arthur's breath caught as the doll's head turned toward him. Its glassy eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Help me, Dad," the voice repeated. Arthur froze, a chill racing down his spine. This wasn't his imagination. The doll wasn't just a toy. It was something else, something far more sinister. And it wasn't going to stop until Arthur gave it what it wanted. Arthur spent the next morning pacing his living room, the doll sitting ominously on the coffee table. He couldn't bring himself to touch it again. The notebook, the whispers, the way its head had turned. It all felt unreal, yet the evidence was right there in front of him. He needed answers, and he needed them now. His first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but the thought of explaining this to another person made his stomach churn. Who would believe him? Instead, he opened his laptop and began typing in everything he could think of. Porcelain sailor doll, haunted dolls, antique shop mysteries. Hours passed, and his search turned up little more than urban legends and vague folklore. Just as he was about to give up, one result caught his eye. A forum post buried in a forgotten corner of the web. The title read, "Doll That Whispers. Anyone heard of this?" Arthur clicked, his heart racing. The post's author described a doll eerily similar to his. A porcelain sailor doll with lifelike features, said to whisper and move on its own. The doll, according to the post, had been passed through several families, each leaving behind tales of tragedy and unexplained events. One reply stood out. "The doll isn't haunted. It's tied to grief," it read. "It forces people to confront their pain. But be warned, it doesn't always stop there. Sometimes it takes more than it gives." Arthur leaned back in his chair, the words sinking in. Tied to grief. He thought of Ethan, of the years they'd spent apart, of the anger and regret that had festered in the silence between them. Was this doll a punishment, or a chance to make things right? A sudden thud from upstairs interrupted his thoughts. Arthur froze, his eyes darting to the ceiling. It came again, a deliberate, heavy sound. He grabbed a fireplace poker and slowly ascended the stairs. The door to Ethan's room was ajar, though he was certain he'd closed it. Pushing it open, he found the doll sitting in the middle of the floor, its head tilted toward the door. The dresser drawer was open, its contents scattered. Old toys, photographs, crumpled letters. Among the mess, Arthur spotted a photograph of him and Ethan, taken years ago on a camping trip. He picked it up, his hands trembling. He remembered that day vividly, the laughter, the bond they'd shared before everything fell apart. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered. The doll stared back, silent and unmoving. Arthur gathered the items and placed them back in the drawer, his mind racing. Was the doll trying to communicate? Was it dredging up these memories on purpose? That evening, he picked up the phone and called Ethan. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. Arthur hesitated before leaving a message. "Ethan, it's me. I know I've hurt you. I need to talk. Please call me back." He hung up, guilt pressing down on him. Would Ethan listen? Would he care? As the hours dragged on, the house grew colder. Arthur sat in the living room staring at the doll. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder. "Help me," the voice said, insistent. Arthur gritted his teeth. "What do you want from me?" he shouted. The doll didn't respond, but the lights flickered and a gust of wind rattled the windows. Arthur stood, his heart pounding. He couldn't take this anymore. Grabbing the doll, he marched to the backyard. He was going to burn it. He built a small fire in the fire pit, the flames crackling in the cool night air. Holding the doll above the fire, he hesitated. The notebook, the memories it unearthed. Destroying the doll felt like destroying a part of himself. But the whispers grew louder. "Help me, Dad," the voice cried. Arthur's hands shook as he lowered the doll, its porcelain face glowing in the firelight. Just as he was about to let go, the voice changed. It was Ethan's voice. "Dad, don't," it said, clear and unmistakable. Arthur stumbled back, dropping the doll onto the ground. Was the doll connected to Ethan somehow? Was it sending him a message? He extinguished the fire, his resolve crumbling. He couldn't destroy it. Not yet. That night, Arthur sat alone, the doll on the coffee table. He didn't sleep, his mind racing with questions. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was even more unnerving. What had this doll brought into his life? At some point, exhaustion overtook him and he dozed off. When he woke, the doll was gone. Panic set in as he searched the house, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. He found it sitting on Ethan's bed, the notebook resting beside it, opened to a new page. Scrawled in the same childlike handwriting were the words, "Talk to him before it's too late." Arthur's phone buzzed just as he read the message. It was a text from Ethan. "I got your message. Let's talk." Arthur's breath caught in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt hope. But as he looked at the doll, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. What had it truly brought him to? And what would it demand next? Arthur's hands trembled as he stared at Ethan's text. For years he had imagined this moment. The call, the apology, the hope for forgiveness. But now that it was real, fear gripped him. Was this the right time? Was he ready to face Ethan and himself? The doll sat in Ethan's old room, its painted smile frozen, its presence looming. Arthur typed a careful response. "Yes, can we meet tomorrow? I need to see you." His finger hovered before pressing send, his chest tightening with anticipation. The hours crawled by as Arthur cleaned aimlessly, avoiding Ethan's room. Each time he passed the closed door, a chill ran down his spine. The doll's glassy gaze felt inescapable, as though it was watching him through the walls. That night, sleep eluded him. When he finally drifted off, the dreams came. He saw Ethan as a child, laughing as he ran through the backyard, but the joy felt distant, like a memory blurred by time. Suddenly, the scene shifted. Ethan was older, his back turned, standing at the edge of the yard. "Help me," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. Arthur reached out, but his feet wouldn't move. Ethan slipped further away, swallowed by darkness. Arthur woke in a cold sweat, gasping for air. Glancing at the clock, he saw it was 3 a.m. He sat up, wiping his face, and decided he couldn't stay in bed any longer. He made his way downstairs but stopped at Ethan's room. Pushing the door open, he found the doll sitting where he had left it, its unblinking eyes fixed ahead. For a moment he considered throwing it out, ending whatever strange connection it seemed to have to his life. But the words in the notebook replayed in his mind. Talk to him before it's too late. Somehow, the doll had pushed him to reach out to Ethan. Was it truly helping, or was it something darker? The next morning, Ethan replied, "I'll come by this afternoon." The words were brief, but enough to stir hope in Arthur. He spent the day preparing the house, ensuring it looked as welcoming as possible. When the knock finally came, his breath caught. He opened the door to see Ethan standing there, older, his features hardened, but still his son. "Thank you for coming," Arthur said softly, stepping aside. Ethan entered cautiously, his eyes scanning the familiar spaces of his childhood. "It's been a long time," Ethan murmured. "It has," Arthur admitted, leading him to the living room. They sat across from each other, an awkward tension settling between them. "Why now?" Ethan asked, his tone guarded. "Why are you reaching out after all this time?" Arthur hesitated. He couldn't explain the doll, not yet. Instead, he said, "Because I was wrong, Ethan. I let my pride and anger get in the way. I should have called you years ago, but I didn't, and I've regretted it every day since." Ethan studied him, his expression unreadable. "It's not that simple," he said after a pause. "You can't just apologize and expect everything to be okay." "I know," Arthur replied, his voice trembling. "I don't expect anything. I just want a chance to make things right." Their conversation unfolded slowly, haltingly. They spoke of past wounds and lingering resentment, each word heavy with emotion. There were moments of tension, but for the first time in years, they were talking. As the afternoon waned, Ethan's gaze drifted toward the staircase. "Is my room still the same?" he asked. Arthur hesitated. "Mostly," he said, "but there's something I want to show you." Ethan followed him upstairs, his steps hesitant. When Arthur opened the door, Ethan froze. The doll sat on the bed, its presence unnerving. "What is that?" Ethan asked sharply. Arthur explained everything: the antique shop, the whispers, the notebook, the dreams. Ethan listened, his disbelief etched on his face. "You're telling me this thing made you call me?" "I don't know," Arthur admitted, "but it's connected to something. Something about us." Ethan stepped closer to the doll, his hand hovering over it. "I don't remember this," he said quietly. "Did you get it for me?" "No," Arthur said. "It wasn't yours, but it's trying to tell me something. Maybe about you, about us." As Ethan's hand brushed the doll, a sudden chill filled the room. Both men shivered as the air seemed to thicken, heavy with an unseen presence. Ethan recoiled, his face pale. "Did you feel that?" Arthur nodded, his throat dry. Before they could speak further, the whispers began. This time they were louder, more desperate. "Help me!" the voice cried, filling the room. The doll's head tilted ever so slightly, its glassy eyes locking onto Ethan. Father and son stared at the doll, their fear palpable. For the first time, Arthur felt certain. This was no ordinary object. It was a doorway, a bridge to something neither of them could fully understand. But what lay beyond, and what was the doll truly leading them toward? The room grew colder as Ethan and Arthur stared at the doll. Its glassy eyes seemed alive now, reflecting the dim light in an unsettling way. Arthur's breath came in short gasps, and Ethan took a step back, shaking his head. "This is insane," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "A doll can't be alive." Arthur wished he could offer an explanation, but he had none. "I don't know, Ethan. I don't know what it is or why it's here, But it brought us back together, didn't it? Maybe that's why it came." Ethan turned his back to the doll, running a hand through his hair. "You think this thing is some kind of messenger? From who? From where?" His voice rose, frustration bubbling over. "It's just a doll, Dad." Arthur's eyes darted to the notebook still tucked under the doll's arm. "It's not just a doll," he said quietly. "It knows things. It knows about us, about what happened, and it wants something." "What could it possibly want?" Ethan asked, exasperated. Arthur hesitated before answering. "To help you. To help us." The whispers returned then, faint at first but growing louder. Both men froze as the words became clearer. "Help me." The childlike voice was filled with anguish echoing off the walls. The doll tilted its head slightly as though listening. Arthur stepped closer to the doll, his hands shaking. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice cracking. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Then the whispers came again, forming chilling words. "Find me." "Find you?" Ethan whispered, his hands trembling. "What does that mean? Who are you?" Arthur opened the notebook, his fingers brushing against the doll's cold porcelain. A crude drawing showed a child in front of a house, one Arthur recognized instantly. "This is our old home." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I haven't been there since I was a kid. How does this thing know about that?" Arthur turned the page, revealing another drawing. This one showed the same child holding the doll, standing between two figures, a man and a boy. Beneath it were the words, "Go back." Ethan clenched his fists. "No, I'm not going back there. That house is where everything fell apart." Arthur's voice softened. "If this thing is tied to our past, we need to go back. It's the only way to understand." Ethan hesitated, his breathing uneven. "And if it's leading us into something worse?" Arthur placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we face it together." Without another word, the two men grabbed their coats and headed for the car, the doll carefully placed in a bag. The drive was silent, the tension in the air almost suffocating. Ethan stared out the window, his jaw clenched while Arthur gripped the steering wheel tightly. The streets were dark and empty, the occasional street lamp casting eerie shadows across their faces. When they reached the house, it was as though time had stood still. The weathered exterior, broken shutters, and overgrown yard looked exactly as Arthur remembered. Ethan hesitated at the gate, his hands trembling. "I don't want to be here," he said. "This place, it's full of ghosts." Arthur placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "We need to face them, together." They entered cautiously, the floorboards creaking under their weight. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust and decay. Arthur set the doll down on the old dining table, its presence dominating the room. "What now?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Help me. Find me." The doll tilted its head again, and the sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Ethan's face paled. "Did you hear that?" Arthur nodded, his hands trembling. "We need to go up there." The two climbed the stairs, the whispers guiding them to Ethan's old room. The door was ajar, faint sobbing drifting out. Arthur pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a child's chair rocking back and forth. On it sat another drawing of the child holding the doll. "What is this?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. Arthur picked up the drawing. It felt damp and icy, like it had been touched by something not entirely of this world. "It's leading us somewhere," Arthur said. "But where?" Before Ethan could respond, the sobbing grew louder, echoing through the walls. The whispers joined it, creating a cacophony that made the room spin. The doll's voice broke through the chaos, clear and haunting. "You left me." Arthur's heart sank. "Who are you?" he cried out. "What do you want from us?" The sobbing stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. Then, softer. "I was yours." Ethan took a step back, his face pale. "This doesn't make any sense," he whispered. "What is this thing talking about?" Arthur shook his head, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. "I don't know, but I think we're about to find out." The chair creaked again, the rocking slowing to a halt. The doll tilted its head one last time before its whispers returned. "Help me. Find me." Arthur and Ethan exchanged a look, their fear mingled with determination. Whatever the doll was leading them to, they knew they had to follow. But the truth it held felt darker than either of them was ready to face. The doll's whispers haunted them as Arthur and Ethan made their way back downstairs. The weight of the house pressed on them, the air feeling thicker with every step they took. Ethan avoided looking at the doll, but Arthur couldn't help glancing at it, its glassy eyes now fixed toward the front door. "Why is it pointing us outside?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. His question hung in the silence between them. Arthur swallowed hard, clutching the notebook tightly. "It's not finished," he murmured. "It's leading us somewhere else." The whispers grew louder as they stepped outside into the cold night air. The overgrown yard, once a place of childhood joy, now felt like the setting for a nightmare. The doll's voice cut through the whispers with chilling clarity. "You left me." Ethan spun around, his voice breaking. "What does it mean? Left who? This doesn't make any sense." Arthur reached out to steady him. "Calm down. We'll figure it out." But his own heart was pounding as he turned the pages of the notebook. Another drawing appeared, this time of the backyard. A child stood near the tree, pointing to the ground. "It's showing us something," Arthur whispered. Ethan hesitated, staring at the towering oak tree that had been there since his childhood. "The tree," he said, his voice heavy with dread. "I remember. Something happened there." "What do you mean?" Arthur asked, his brow furrowing. Ethan shook his head, his memories a tangle of fear. "I don't know. I was so young, but I remember crying. I remember you yelling." Arthur's stomach dropped. "Ethan, I don't remember anything like that." His voice faltered as an old unease began to stir. The doll's whispers grew frantic now. "Dig! Dig!" Arthur grabbed a rusty shovel from the shed. Together they approached the tree, the whispers intensifying. "Here," Ethan said, pointing to a patch of earth. The whispers seemed to confirm it. "Here, here." Arthur plunged the shovel into the dirt. Ethan clawed at the soil as they dug deeper. Soon, Arthur's shovel hit something solid. Both men froze. "What is that?" Ethan whispered. Arthur brushed away the dirt, revealing a small wooden box. The sight sent a chill through him. "Open it," Ethan urged, though his face was pale. Arthur hesitated before prying the lid open. Inside was a child's doll, not the one they brought, but an older version. Beneath it was a photograph, faded and yellowed. Arthur picked up the photo with shaking hands. It showed a young girl, no older than 6, standing between two adults. Her face was eerily familiar. "Do you recognize her?" Ethan asked, though the answer was clear. Arthur nodded. "That's your sister." Ethan's breath hitched. "I don't have a sister." Arthur closed his eyes, the truth crashing down. "You did. You were too young to remember, but she was here. This house, this tree." His voice broke as tears welled in his eyes. Ethan stepped back, shaking his head. "What happened to her, Dad? What happened to my sister?" Arthur couldn't speak, the memories rushing back in fragments. The laughter, the accident. The night he buried her beneath the tree, unable to face the truth or tell anyone, not even Ethan. The whispers returned, softer now. "You left me. You forgot me." Ethan sank to his knees. "You buried her here? How could you forget her?" "I didn't forget," Arthur whispered. "I couldn't face it. I thought I was protecting you." The doll tilted its head one last time. "Help me. Remember me." Arthur reached for the older doll, cradling it like a fragile piece of the past. "I'm sorry," he said, his tears falling freely. "I'm so sorry." The whispers grew fainter, the house falling silent. Ethan helped Arthur place the box back into the ground, this time laying her to rest properly. As they stood beneath the tree, Arthur's voice broke the silence. "I should have told you, Ethan. I should have faced the truth, for both of us. I let my fear control me." Ethan wiped his face, his own emotions raw. "It doesn't make it okay, Dad, but at least now I understand." The doll in the house gave one final whisper. "Thank you." Its head tilted back and the house seemed to exhale, releasing years of sorrow. When they walked back inside, Arthur hesitated near the doll. Its presence, once suffocating, now felt hollow, emptied of whatever force had haunted it. "Do you think it's finished?" he asked. Ethan stood by the door, watching his father. "It doesn't erase anything, Dad. What's done is done. But maybe it's trying to tell us it's time to let go." Arthur nodded, his shoulders heavy with the weight of years he could never reclaim. "Letting go doesn't mean forgetting," he murmured. "It means making peace." The house grew quieter with each passing moment, as though it were finally at rest. Ethan and Arthur stepped outside, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. As they reached the gate, Arthur turned back for one final look. The windows were dark, the whispers gone. "Goodbye," Arthur said softly, unsure if he was speaking to the house, the doll, or the memories. For the first time in years, the silence between father and son felt like something they could live with.